Good morning. Yes, I'm recording this in the morning for a change. And I will be reading you a story which I wrote for a little sort of collection of friends who meet regularly. We don't all, but we often read stories to one another, and usually at Christmas we come up with something spooky or strange, so that's what I have for you today. Something strange, spooky, seasonal. See if you like it. It's not based on random words. It's an idea I had based on a few things. Maybe I'll go into them at the end. I don't want to bore you too much before the story. What I would like you to do, if you haven't done so already, is subscribe to the channel. So just press that little subscribe button and you will help me grow and help this crazy thing grow. We'll maybe get some other writers in, we'll get some other performers in. That's what I'd like to do with the channel. So, if you do enjoy this story or any of the other pieces I produce, then say so and share it and subscribe and do all the other lovely things that make the algorithm excited. I'm going to drink my coffee now. Alright, so, oh yes, and if you're still short of a present, Amazon can probably still deliver a copy of my latest book, Run for the Hell of It, which is 50 running adventures from 5k to 100 miles. So if you want to find out what it's like to run a 100-mile race or run to a remote Scottish beach in the pouring rain, then this is the book for you. And after all my advertising and sales pitch, here is story number 147, and it's called The White Widow. I'm almost certainly the postman at the highest altitude in the British Isles, not a claim to fame I ever envisaged in my youth. Assynt's rocky trails, many of them eroded into a slurry of mud and gravel by autumn storms, are treacherous at the best of times, and the stretch I'm currently essaying between Coolnacraig and Duncanna is especially forbidding. The fact that it's snowing heavily and has been for several hours should give me pause. The woman who owns the guest house, at which I'm the only resident, accosted me this morning armed with a pot of tea, scones, a sad shake of the head, and the words, well, you'll no be wondering the posties path the morn. She said it as if it were a foregone conclusion, but I am adamantine when I've a scheme in mind, and today would be no different. And so, belly filled at 7 with a hearty cooked breakfast, then a second entirely gratuitous breakfast, I set off with my Swiss walking poles, Arctic cagoule, woolen hat, heavy gloves, 2 pairs of socks, and sensibly cleated footwear. I may be a little reckless, but I'm not entirely stupid. My current mission began, as many such missions do, when I became irreparably lost on an obscure trail, one leading from the site of the prehistoric fort at Duncanna, northeast to the village of Strathkinnaird. This occurred a month ago on the last trip I took with my wife Emily, before she finally succumbed to that degenerate little tumour in her frontal lobe. Emily sat sensibly ensconced by the fire in the local pub, reading, while I set out on what was to be my last trail run. I just turned 72, and my knees weren't up to the task of louping up rock faces or shuddering down scree slopes. It had become too dangerous. Besides, even walking these remote Scottish outposts in one's fading decades is an act of exceptional optimism. The weather changes with fearful suddenness, and fair becomes foul at the whim of the gods. I'd made it 4 miles in, following the course of a burn. I was smugly glad I'd thought to wear plastic bags over my socks before putting on my hiking boots, a trick of my own invention. The boots were sodden from waterlogged stretches of peaty moorland, but my feet remained cosy. However, the rain progressed gradually from a misty smurr to a diagonal deluge. After an hour of this, having utterly lost the sheep path I'd been following, I began to have recurring fantasies of joining my wife in the Twa Corby's pub, whisky at hand, crackling fire warming my extremities. In that moment my willpower broke, and I turned for home, immediately tripped over a rock, and fell face first into the heather. The stumble didn't hurt or injure me, and nor was my pride much affected. I abandoned that luxury when old age began to render it redundant. Besides, there was nobody bar a few bedraggled sheep to notice my fall. I turned to see what I'd tripped over, and there, half concealed by bracken, was a hewn stone, rather like a miniature headstone or mile marker, its base firmly implanted in the soil. I pushed wet fronds aside to examine it. It was a piece of lichen-speckled granite, but it appeared to have indentations carved into one side. I looked closer and fancied I could make out the shape of a feminine face in profile on a border of decorative swirls. It was a familiar shape, but one that escaped my understanding until I made it back to the pub and recounted the incident to my wife. "Ha!" She simply laughed once I'd finished my narrative. "Then you fared better than the last man who stumbled there." What on earth was she talking about? I asked her to explain her cryptic utterance, and she unfolded a strange story that made sinister sense of my wayward wanderings. It transpired she'd abandoned her novel for one of the books from the Corby's own miniature library, mostly folklore, mawkish poetry, and local history. One of these texts had been entitled Postal Paths and the Drove Roads of Assynt, by one Herbert B. Mannheim. The maps in the middle of this text had piqued her interest. It seems that once the penny post was initiated, Emily explained, the local postal service received a flood of business. People began sending one another postcards, small gifts, love letters and other communications previously considered excessive. This created a problem of volume and efficiency for the post office, which had to send horse and carriage along old military roads and overgrown drove paths. They decided to enlist a team of fit young men to shoulder backpacks full of correspondence and walk them over the more direct but treacherous footpaths. They did this so efficiently they'd sometimes beat carriages forced to take much longer routes. Of course, quite frequently there would be accidents, and even deaths, Emily explained, her tone darkening. One such mishap befell a 19-year-old youth recruited to the postal service from Glasgow. He'd been teased by some of the local boys. They'd mentioned a grim spectre, a young veiled woman who led men astray. Although it was almost certainly an attempt to terrify this new recruit, one Hamish McAlpine, for cruel satisfaction, there was a link to local folklore, Emily revealed. Songs and poems told of a white widow who'd walked the hills and crags and had the ability to transform into a seagull, a skirl of mist, or even a sheet of wind-blown snow. She was widowed on the eve of her wedding, they say, Emily explained, and hanged herself wearing her wedding dress. Folk think she wanders these lands searching for the shade of her fiancé, a farmer who'd perished in a terrible snowstorm. "So they scared this young postman with the story," I said. "What has that to do with my falling over in the heather?" "The headstone," Emily said. "Some think it's there to honour the farmer who died, since it's right in the middle of his family's grazing land. The woman depicted is supposed to be his betrothed, but others say it's dedicated to Hamish McAlpine. You see, he never returned from his first foray out in the postal paths. His body was never found." "But the carving on the stone," I said, and here Emily seemed to anticipate me, as she often did. "It's a penny black." Of course, that's why the image was so familiar. The young Victoria, ornately framed, my grandfather's philately books I pored over as a child. "That's astounding," I said, bending to kiss my wife on the forehead. There was an odd clamminess about her skin, despite her proximity to the fire. I should have sensed she'd be taken from me within weeks. We didn't spend nearly enough time together on that last trip. A regret, I suspect, will never leave me. Emily had mentioned that there was a small collection of local antiquities in the village hall, so I waited out that wet weekend, and then, at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning, we both took a stroll to the small but sturdy stone building which contained a small meeting room, a low curtained stage, and a couple of side rooms. One of these had a handwritten sign on its door, reading "Local Collections." The young woman who manned the reception desk, Miss Finian, unlocked the door for us and led us through to a musty, damp-smelling library with a writing desk, a few church pews, a plan chest, and 3 cases. 2 were bookcases filled with old tomes, too tedious to relate. The middle case, however, was a glass-fronted display of miscellaneous artefacts, including Pictish jewellery, pieces of a Viking helmet, and, oddest of all, an almost unmarked and empty envelope, bearing the remnants of a blob of sealing wax, but no stamp or postmark. The card beneath this last item read, "Letter found on the high path by Duncanna, thought undelivered." Could that have belonged to Hamish McAlpine? I couldn't help but wonder aloud. "That it could!" came a stout voice from behind us, making me start. We turned, and a reddish-faced man in his late 40s stood there, rocking on his heels. He thrust out a meaty paw, which, after some hesitation, I shook. "Jeff Truss," he said, as if his name explained something. "Local postman, and general busybody." Over Truss's shoulder I saw Miss Finian raise an arched eyebrow as she hovered solicitously. Are you the writers? He beamed. I'd forgotten how fast word travels in such tiny communities. Well, I'm a writer. My wife's an academic. Emily tutted. And a writer too, she admonished, brushing her own hand against trusses. Though only if 16th century Italian poetry is your cup of tea. Then she laughed in that generous, mellifluous way that never failed to melt my heart. Emily made everyone feel welcome, and included. Moments later, she and Truss were fast friends, and we were sitting huddled like co-conspirators on a pew, discussing the history of the postal pass thereabouts, which Truss, unsurprisingly, knew rather a lot about. It was there, in that draughty village hall, and later in the firelit lounge of the Corbys, that a strange plan developed. A scheme that I shared only with Emily, one I'm now enacting, here on this storm-scoured cliff face. The idea was so exciting I called my editor immediately, pitching my idea for a semi-autobiographical account of wandering the postal pass of Assynt, carrying the last undelivered letter of a young tragically slain postman. Exactly the kind of thing the glossy supplement in question laps up. I had my commission within minutes. In fact, I was so carried away by both my own and my editor's enthusiasm that I entirely forgot to answer one vital question. How would I get hold of the letter? Fortunately, once again, Emily solved my conundrum. Tell them you've arranged to have it DNA tested at my university, so they can know once and for all if it was handled by Hamish McAlpine. They've got bits of his uniform. It'll certainly have hairs or skin flakes. My colleagues are in the genetics lab, can run a quick check. Will they do that? They will if I sweet-talk them. In the meantime, you can take it on your weird little pilgrimage, if it means so much to you. I could really explain it to her, but somehow it did. Emily fired off an email to a friend at the university, although we had to leave for Edinburgh before she got a reply. Before that happened, however, Emily's condition abruptly worsened and she was hospitalised. She died just 6 days later. After the funeral and all the rigmarole around her last will and testament, I let my routine slide until my son Gareth prompted me to shake myself out of my funk. I finally felt able to read my emails a week ago. I found 3 of immediate interest amongst the condolences, offers of assistance and junk mail. The first was from Emily's colleague's laboratory confirming the booking for the document DNA check. The second was a gentle prompt from the magazine editor who wanted my Assynt piece. The third, however, was the clincher. It was from Emily. She must have sent it a couple of days before she passed. I've no idea how, since I was at her bedside almost constantly. Yet somehow my wife managed to cajole me from beyond the grave. After relaying many fond reminiscences, too painful to relate here, the letter ended with a curt command: "Do not mope." Then a single kiss and her familiar ornate e-signature. And that's why I'm here, tottering along this snow-blasted edge, where the contour line seems to stumble over one another, and my feet are liable to do likewise. I'm a ridiculous old man, pursuing this perilous quest, and I'm probably going to end up the same way as the White Widow's fiancé and Hamish, the novice postie, perishing here on a frozen nub overlooking the Atlantic. I've seemingly lost the proper path to Coolnacraig, and the slim runnel I'm following now is spotted with a suspiciously large number of sheep droppings. The path veers away from the sheer edge of the cliffs, below which seabirds whirl, and heads uphill and inland, alongside a row of tormented trees. Too gnarly to identify, they resemble beseeching penitents, their hands stretched out towards a thin V-shaped valley through which a burn tumbles. I make for it, noting that a similar blue vein is marked on my map. In my backpack there's an A4 document folder, inside which is a Ziploc bag containing the letter found near Duncanna. Emily, Miss Finian, Truss and I examined it with a magnifying glass before I carefully placed it between sheets of plastic and PVC. The name and address, oddly enough, were just visible, although the writing on the letter itself seemed to have faded into insubstantiality. Perhaps written with a different pen and less durable ink, Miss Finian opined. Of course, we had no way of knowing if the single sheet of paper folded into quarters within the onion skin thin envelope had ever contained writing. Perhaps some odd character had mailed a love token, such as a pressed flower or a lock of hair, concealed within that vellum sheet. A sentimental trifle now lost to the ages. What we did know was that the letter was addressed as follows: "The lady in the last house by the falls at Balwhinnie," and that was all. "Must be the row of abandoned crofts," Truss muttered. "There's bugger all of consequence there now." I couldn't help but wonder, though. Was this letter addressed to the White Widow herself? Was it part of some elaborate prank by the postie's colleagues? On later examination, however, the timeline didn't work. 6 months had passed between the death of the betrothed Crofters and young McAlpine setting out on his fateful journey. Whatever this message was would remain mysterious. I rather liked not knowing, I convinced myself. It would give me more to speculate about in my essay. That is, if I ever reach my destination. The snow, which had consisted of thin confetti-like swirls, is now coming down in concentrated sheets, slicing across my path and eroding the very sheep track I'm walking. There's an eerie silence to it, like a television channel detuned to static, with the sound turned all the way down. I feel winter's fingers penetrating my many layers, burrowing into the gap between scarf and coat, clasping at my ankles whenever my trouser leg rides up. Still I press on. I could hardly do otherwise. I estimate I've been walking for 2.5 hours, and I'm scarcely 5 miles into my walk, with 2 more to go. I look at my wristwatch, a gift from Emily, allowing icy flakes to caress my wrist for a moment. 2:55 p.m. At this time of year it will be dark by 4. I'd better hurry. I begin to march stiff-legged, chin pushed down onto my chest. This continues for agonizing, incalculable minutes. I hear a waterfall's tumult pierce the fearful silence. I look up and the path has vanished, although the valley's dark slash can still just be discerned through the whiteout. Then something altogether stranger occurs. The descending flakes seem to spiral together before me, perhaps simply an eddying current of air, and yet, for a fanciful moment, they seem to form a shape, a feminine form, arm outstretched, pointing. I rub my eyes, certain I'm delirious. I can't have seen a figure swathed in white, head shawled in some sort of veil. This is perhaps the first indication of a dangerous chill. Can people experiencing the first signs of hypothermia hallucinate? When I open my watery eyes, most of the form has vanished, yet a head, shoulder and arm still float for a split second before dissolving on the wind. I follow the line of the spectre's finger. I see indications of a route, the merest suggestion of a path, a deeper channel of fresh snow among the hummocky heather. I march on, trying not to dwell upon what I've seen. Suggestion can be a marvellous thing, and I've been thinking of little more than the White Widow and my Emily for the last several hours. I follow the possible path towards the waterfall's roar, and there it is, half frozen into icicles, concealed and then revealed between granite slabs of shattered mountainside. My boots slip and slither as I clamber among the wet rocks, and there I finally spot what I've been looking for, the remains of a cut stone, long and oblong and spotted with moss, but undeniably a lintel. Around it there are several piles of old stone and fragments of long rotten wood, indicating that a house once stood here, with its back to the falls and its face to the sea, between cascade and ocean's roar, and certainly the last croft at Balwhinnie. I duck behind a long slanting slab which offers some respite from the blizzard. Shucking off my pack, I open it, unzip the document folder with shaking hands and extract the clear Ziploc bag. I'm not sure what I expect to happen, but I have an unaccountable craving to press the ancient letter against the lintel stone. I should not unzip the bag and take the paper out, I think, whilst finding myself doing exactly that. A flash of the White Widow's spectral head slowly turning to face me flickers into mind, and I panic, picking at the paper as the wind catches it and whirls it out of my grasp. "No!" I shout aloud, thinking of the trouble I'll provoke if I lose this precious local artefact. I run from my enclosure, leaping into deep snow and clutching for the spinning, teasing parchment, and of course I fall there, tumbling helplessly as so many have before me. The farmer, McAlpine the postie, and now Benjamin Tulloch, writer, widower, hill-walker, and miscreant. I fall, and the blackness comes rushing in, with the blizzard its veiled companion. 2 things stand out from the dream that soon pursues me. First, the unaccountable fragrance of mountain thyme, and secondly, a fragment of an old poem, one I'd read with Emily by the freshly stoked fire of the Twa Corbies Inn. I will twin thee a bower by the clear silver fountain, and I'll cover it o'er with the flowers of the mountain. I will range through the wilds and the deep glens to dreary, and return with the spoils to the bower of my dearie. Will you go, lassie, go? I add, feeling an unaccountable warmth on both eyelids, a delicate kiss such as Emily once bestowed. I spasm back into consciousness, opening my eyes to see a sky darkening but thankfully free from icy petals spiralling down. I have no idea how long I've lain there, perhaps a couple of minutes, maybe more, before something woke me. I don't discover it until much later that day, but there's a small gash in my scalp just under the hairline, but the blood is frozen stiff within my matted locks. My face and extremities feel oddly warm. I know this can't be a good thing, so I haul myself stiffly to my feet and look about me. There is my backpack, half covered in snow, in the lee of the granite slab. And there, remarkably, just 6 feet away, is the letter, wet through and wrapped like a lover's embrace around the lintel stone. I very gently peel it free and slip it back into the Ziploc bag. My watch reveals that I have only blacked out momentarily. That said, every minute counts on a Scottish winter's evening, so I grit my teeth, sling the backpack over my shoulder, and begin to march up the rocky path I can now clearly discern crossing the top of the waterfall and continuing up and over the ridge. A little under 40 minutes later, I reach Coolnacraig, where a very worried Jeff Truss is waiting in his red post office van, having arranged to meet me there and drive me back to my guest house. I'd only told him about my plan to walk the postal routes alone. I'd shared nothing about the presence of the letter in my backpack. "What kept you?" he jokes, relief flooding his features as he ushers me into the warm vehicle. "Waylaid by the White Widow," I reply, as deadpan as I can muster, while wondering if what I've just jokingly suggested is in fact true. If I have encountered a phantasm, was she pointing to her long-destroyed domicile or to the path to safety? Were her motives self-serving or charitable? 3 days later I'm back in Edinburgh and heading to a potentially futile rendezvous. I've carefully dried off the 19th century missive in a takeaway box layered with muslin on the top of a radiator turned down low. I'm now due to hand it over to Professor Sarah Hamlin of the Historic Documents Department at Edinburgh University. "What are you hoping to find out?" the surprisingly young, sincere professor asks me, almost as if I'm handing over a long-cherished family heirloom. I sigh. "Oh, anything at all. Here's a couple of hairs from the postman who may have attempted to deliver the letter." I hand over the tiny test tube that Miss Finian gave me, containing 2 small twisted fibres, which he assured me came from Hamish McAlpine's bunnet. "Don't hope for too much," Professor Hamlin cautions. "After this length of time, the chances of getting any live DNA are slim." So it proves. I know from the regretful cast of the professor's face when I meet her in her departmental office 10 days later that she's found nothing definitive. We can't say for certain who handled the letter, and in fact, we couldn't even find evidence that anything had been written on it. I nod, expecting as much. A disappointing end to a long overdue article. My editor will not be pleased. "Well, there was one odd thing," she adds, almost in consolation. "We detected the presence of some sort of herb, maybe thyme. I might even speculate." Here Professor Hamlin pauses, leaning in like a naughty schoolgirl. "Well, it's possible that a love token, such as a sprig of mountain thyme, was enclosed. It was often a component of wedding favours worn close to the bride's breast. Would that make any sense?" I have an extraordinary and instant realisation, one accompanied by entirely unreasonable certainty. The letter has nothing to do with my wayward postman at all. McAlpine might simply have found the letter on his wanderings that day and felt compelled to deliver it even months after the doomed farmer had addressed it. This would explain the absence of a stamp. "It makes perfect sense, Professor," I reply, without elaborating. I somehow don't want to share my theory. It feels too intimate. Professor Hamlin frowns slightly, the 2 tiny furrows on either side of her nose at the brow reminding me of Emily's quizzical expression when humouring me. "I suppose I will always be pursuing my own ghosts, after all, whether wandering snow-scattered moorlands or simply dreaming. We are all walking fading trails with only one ultimate destination, after all." And that was The White Widow. So, sort of based on some of my experiences up north. Not a little bit recently I went running in the snow, but it wasn't as intense as that. It wasn't snowing as I was running. But I've been to these wild places in the far northwest and they're kind of stunning and very remote. And I've read about the postie paths, that's a real thing. There are paths that were sort of the designated route of postmen who used to lug their local messages by hand. And The other element was actually dates back to when I was running in France in 2018, rural France, and I used to see sort of weird swirls of powdery snow blowing along the road, and they sort of made strange forms and looked almost alive as they were blowing in front of me, so I thought I would try and use that image. So there you have it. That is The White Widow, and I shall be sending it out probably soon once I've done a little bit of pruning and tweaking. I'll send it out to some magazines and maybe get it published. And that's what this channel is all about, unlocking creativity. And I would recommend anyone to try the 5 random words method. And if you want to be on this channel or have your story on this channel, all you need to do is send me a message, private message, or even a comment on this video. Leave me your contact email address, and I will send you some random words to come up with a story based on. And if it's good, if I like it, I may read it or invite you to do so on this very channel. That's the idea anyway. That's how I want to expand it. But failing that, I will keep reading and writing and reading stories, and I will come back probably with another video about how to write, or how to get published, or filmmaking even, something like that. Anyway, have a good Christmas if I don't see you before the big day, and yeah, goodbye for now. Bye.